I'm now really excited to introduce our first academic panel, which will be led by Professor David Yermack. And Professor Yermack is the chairman of the finance department here at Stern, and also the Albert Fingerhut chairman of business transformation. And as one of the first academic researchers to tackle the implications of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, his work really cast a halo and inspired a generation of faculty exploring this whole terrain. So he's put together a very exciting panel of experts to introduce you to the latest academic thinking about decentralized finance, and specifically the topic of decentralized lending. So Professor Yermack, welcome, and he will introduce his panelists.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. And as Kathleen said, we're going to focus on one slice of DeFi, the lending space, which is one of several areas where the growth is coming extremely quickly. So we have three academic colleagues, and it's a very global panel. We're going to have speakers coming from first Switzerland, then Italy, and then continuing to move to the east, ultimately from Thailand. And I think this is one of the benefits of the Zoom technology, is that we can bring together people from all over the world in real time like this. So we will hear first from Professor Fabian Schär at the University of Basel in Switzerland. And I'd ask each speaker to take 15 minutes, and we will save the remaining time at the end for questions. So welcome, Fabian.
Okay, it's exciting to be here. I quickly try to share my slides. Should be able to see them right now. And as Professor Yermack already said, I'm going to talk about a primer on DeFi lending. So I've been asked to give you a primer introduction on that specific topic. So when I talk about decentralized finance, where I like to start is with this graph right here. That's something I published a while ago with the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And I refer to as the DeFi stack. Gives you a good indication what DeFi actually is. The first thing we have to look at is the settlement layer, so the really foundation of decentralized finance. And that's important because, unfortunately, there are many misconceptions. In some cases, people think of heavily centralized infrastructure, like the Libra, Diems of this world, as DeFi. And that's not correct here. We talk about public ledgers, public blockchains, and most of the action in DeFi originally was on the Ethereum blockchain. Now there are many different variants of that. The idea is that you have this ledger, this blockchain, where you can also run smart contracts on top of that. But most importantly, what you have as a second layer is the so-called asset layer. So you're issuing additional assets. And assets in the blockchain context are usually referred to as tokens. Now, you might have heard things like ERC20, ERC721, 1155. These are just really complex terms for something that's super simple, and it's essentially a template for these tokens, a smart contract template to issue these tokens. So it's a way to bring additional assets on these blockchains. And then when you have these assets, on top of that, you have something I refer to as the protocol layer. And there you have the exchanges, lending protocols, derivative protocols, asset management protocols, and so on. Now, what's special is, again, these things, these protocols are essentially smart contracts running in a permissionless way, running on that blockchain. Anyone can interact with them. And today, as I said, we will focus on this part right here on the lending part. Now, on top of the protocol layer, there are things like application layers, aggregation layers. These essentially are front ends that aggregate many of these different protocols. That's not the topic of today, but that's the entire DeFi stack. So let's zoom in on the lending part. When we talk about different kinds of DeFi loans, then you have to be aware that there are, three major types. Number one is usually referred to as a CDP, or an on-chain collateralized stablecoin vault. Number two is a lending pool, also sometimes a liquidity pool, or a CDM. And then the third thing, and that's probably the most special and most novel one, are flash loans. And when we look at the first two first, then the question is, what characterizes these different kinds of DeFi loans? Both of them are collateralized. That's super important. Also makes sense in the absence of any identities, in the absence of any trusted relationships. It has to be collateralized. So you have no trusted counterparty. But the big difference between the two is that in the first case, we are talking about newly minted assets. So you're creating something new. You're locking up some collateral in the form of crypto assets, and then you're minting something new. In most cases, stable coins. And the second part right here is a market pool for existing crypto assets. So where you have multiple parties connecting to one lending pool and then essentially exchanging liquidity, taking some loans. Flash loans I will talk about later on. What's special of flash loans already as a quick teaser is they are neither collateralized nor is there a trusted relationship, and they work because of the technical characteristics of this particular blockchain. Now let's start with the on-chain collateralized vaults or the CDP collateralized debt positions. In most cases, as I said, it's really for stablecoins, for a specific type of stablecoins that is on-chain collateralized stablecoins, meaning that there is a smart contract, a protocol issuing a new token, a token whose job is to serve as a stablecoin that is pegged to the US dollar and essentially is backed by crypto assets. So how does it work? You can think of it, you have a user right here, and for the issuance, that user deposits some crypto assets on a smart contract, invokes a function of the smart contract, transfers the funds to the smart contract. These funds are locked on the smart contract, and here we really talk about crypto assets. And then once this collateral is locked on the smart contract, the user can mint these stablecoins. So it's a new token, newly created, backed by the crypto collateral. Redemption, similarly, just the other way around. The user pays back the stablecoins plus a potential interest rate, stability fee, and can redeem the crypto assets that have been locked up before. Now, obviously, there is one problem. When we talk about crypto assets, there is a high volatility. These things are not stable. If they would be stable, there would be no need for a stablecoin in the first place, so we wouldn't need these things. So there is some volatility. And when you look at this graph right here, you assume that the collateral in this case is Ether, which is a specific crypto asset, and there's a certain depth. Then the smart contract assumes that there is a minimum collateralization factor, there's a threshold, and the collateral, the crypto collateral at all points in time has to be above this minimum collateralization threshold right here. Now, when we look at some potential price movements, it might go up and down a little bit, up. Then at some point, it could happen that the price of the collateral drops as sharply that it goes below this threshold value right here. And then you have something we could refer to as a decentralized margin call. Essentially, it's quite similar to what we see in traditional finance, with the consequence that there is a function that can be invoked by anyone that opens up to liquidate that position. So anyone, any third party can, when the collateral is below this threshold value, liquidate the position, pay back some of the debt, and assume ownership of some of the collateral. And they do that, they get incentivized because there is a certain premium, and the person who got liquidated pays the price in the form of a liquidation penalty. So that's the concept. That's how you can ensure that these positions stay healthy, and if they are not healthy, the person will get liquidated. The lending pools are a little different. With the lending pools, there is an additional party involved. So I'm call them Alice and Bob right here. And then you have the liquidity pool again, a smart contract. And it starts by Alice adding some assets, in this case, asset X, as a collateral and also as a form of liquidity to the liquidity pool. What Alice receives in return is a IBT, an interest-bearing token variant of X. And the most dominant forms are A tokens from the Aave protocol and C tokens from the Compound protocol. And this essentially allows Alice to redeem the collateral at a later point in time, but it also is a way that accrues interest. Okay, the interest payments are directly embedded on that token. Now, let's assume that Bob does a similar thing with asset Y. Bob locks up asset Y on this liquidity pool, receives an interest-bearing token for asset Y. And now this liquidity pool has certain assets in there, X tokens and Y tokens in this case. And Alice, for example, could say, long-term, I believe in asset X, but I need some short-term liquidity, asset Y. If you assume that's a stablecoin again, and could take a loan in asset Y. Again, this loan would be collateralized by asset X in this case. So there is collateral on the liquidity pool, and she would, of course, pay some interest to the liquidity pool, which then can be used to repay Bob. But then the payments would really be between Alice and the liquidity pool and the liquidity pool and Bob in this case. How is the interest determined? Well, interest rate depends on the utilization. So I'm not going really deeply into the math right here because we simply don't have the time. I give you some resources later on if you want to look it up, if you're interested in that. But what you can see right here is essentially the interest rate is a function of the utilization. The utilization is just supply and demand, obviously. And in most cases, for most of these protocols, smart contract protocols, it's really a two-slope case function so that they determine some optimal utilization. And then you have a steeper slope when it's above that utilization and a relatively slow slope when it's below that optimal utilization. If you're interested in the math in a more formal approach, there is an entire lecture just on that on cryptolectures.teachable.com. That's our open access lectures. And there I talk 1.5 hours just about this specific part of DeFi lending. Flash loans is the last part. And that's probably the most exciting part and also the hardest to understand because that's something completely new, something that does not exist in traditional finance. Now, let me give you the intuition really quickly. In traditional finance, what you have usually is when you have a loan, either secured loans so that you have collateral or that you have a trusted counterparty, that you know someone, you have an established trust relationship, but then you have a known identity. With flash loans, you have neither of these two. So you have no collateral whatsoever, and you also do not know who you're engaging with. And that sounds a lot like a recipe for disaster if we think in terms of traditional finance, because obviously the person who takes out the loan would have an incentive to run away. You couldn't really do anything about it if you don't know who it is. But there is some technicality in the EVM, in the Ethereum virtual machine, and the way this is set up, that these things can still work. And that's something that's extremely exciting, an extremely exciting part of DeFi lending. Unfortunately, I think the term flash loan is not ideal. So let me propose an alternative name. I usually refer to these things as conditional sandwich loans. And I want to give you the reasoning why I refer to them as conditional sandwich loans. I think it's easiest to think of these loans as sandwiches. The first thing you have to know is the sandwich you see here essentially corresponds to a single transaction. So the entire loan will be just one single transaction. Now, that doesn't sound too exciting if you think of a traditional finance transaction, but you have to understand that in a blockchain context, a transaction can do so many different things at once. So it can invoke multiple functions. We can, for example, take out the loan first, then you go to a decentralized exchange, you exchange the funds there, then you restructure your portfolio, you engage with a different decentralized exchange, and so on. So step after step after step. And this is still referred to as one inseparable transaction. And that's exactly the principle of these flash loans. So the first thing you have are the two bread slices. The very top bread slice right here is that from a smart contract, you can get any available amount X. That's basically your loan. X are the tokens here, and you get that. And that's the first step. That's a mandatory step in these flash loan transactions. The last step in these flash loan transactions, that's also mandatory, is that you pay back the amount X plus interest. Okay, and that's embedded in the transaction. That's an essential part of the transaction, one you cannot remove. In between, you can do whatever you want. You can execute any code. You can have as many internal transactions as you like. You can interact with different protocols, with different exchanges whatsoever. But remember that this part right here, this is also part of the transaction, so you have to pay it back. Now, the atomicity principle of these blockchain transactions ensures that you cannot just remove that part, okay? So that part will always be checked at the end of the transaction. And if this final step fails, if you cannot pay back the amount X, then the entire transaction will fail, okay? It's still added to the blockchain, but it will not lead to any state changes. There will be no effects of that transaction. So in other words, it's like, you can think of it a little bit like a time machine. It is as if this loan has never occurred. Now, why does it work? Well, since there cannot be any other transactions in between, since you have a strict transaction sequence on the blockchain, we don't have to be worried that there are any consequences for any other trades. Everything that is part of this transaction happens in exactly this sequence with no other transactions in between. And that's why there is no consequence if it gets rewarded at the end of the day. Now, let me quickly present you a payoff structure, a payoff diagram for the person who takes out these flash loans. Here with X star, I denote the amount that is left in the transaction when the transaction concludes. So basically what is left as part of the transaction in the assets at the end of the transaction. And here with pi x star, that is the profit for the person who takes out the flash loan. So the person who borrows money essentially. Epsilon is the network fee, so the gas fee for the blockchain network. And rho and phi, these are fees for the flash loan itself, a relative one, and that could be closely related to an interest rate, and the flat fee with phi. There are some protocols who have just one of these. There are some protocols who have both of these. But what is important to understand is that there essentially are three cases. There can be a reversion. So when whatever is left at the end of the transaction is below this value right here. So when you're not able to pay back the protocol, then the transaction will be reverted and you just pay the network fee. If you're above this threshold, so if you are able to pay back the protocol, if you are able to pay back the flash loan, then it will be executed, and it can be either executed with a loss because you're still paying the network fee, or it can be executed with a profit, okay, if you're above that. And that's the payoff structure for these flash loans. What is exciting is that essentially you can use these things for arbitrage opportunities if you have absolutely no capital to start with, except, of course, for the transaction fee you have to pay. But you can have very limited capital. You can still make use of these arbitrage opportunities. In that way, flash loans are a super exciting tool to make financial markets much more efficient. Some resources, references. First of all, the paper I've published with the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, the overview paper, then one where we analyze the distribution of governance tokens. Governance is a huge topic, of course, in DeFi, forthcoming with the Journal of Blockchain Research. Book we published at MIT Press called Bitcoin, Blockchain, Crypto Assets, and then our open access lectures where we have a special course on DeFi and smart contract programming. With that, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Fabian. I'm not sure that conditional sandwich loan is quite as catchy as flash loan, but I understand the intuition. Our second speaker is Professor Massimo Bartoletti. His background is actually in computer science, but we are very much an interdisciplinary field. And he's speaking today from the Italian island of Sardinia, I believe, at his home university, yes, the University of Cagliari. So welcome, yes. Massimo.
Thank you. I have one slight introduction to the whole DeFi and lending pools, but I just needed to give the notation that I used to these slides. So the DeFi ecosystem is made of a variety of different archetypes. The two main archetypes are lending pools and automated market makers that together contribute to the majority of the capitalization of DeFi. And different archetypes feature different primitive interactions between the protocol and the users. For instance, AMMs, the main interaction is the swap, which allows a user to exchange units of tokens in a wallet with units of tokens in the AMM. While for lending pools, two main interactions are the deposit, through which participant Alice lends tokens to the lending pool, and borrow, which initiates a collateralized loan for a user B in this case. To borrow tokens from the lending pool, the collateralization of B must be above a certain threshold seen here. But when the collateralization of B falls below this threshold, any other user with enough tokens in a wallet can liquidate the whole or part of the loan. And in this way, it takes the collateral from the other users. Nice thing about DeFi is that these basic protocols can be combined to give rise to more complex interactions. For instance, a lending pool could exploit an AMM as a price oracle to perform liquidations. A big problem with DeFi protocols is that they are inherently complex. And there are several reasons that motivate this complexity. The first issue that contributes to the complexity of DeFi is that we have seen that there are many possible interactions, but unfortunately there is no high-level precise specification of their behavior. Eventually, to really understand what a primitive interaction does, one must inspect the implementation of the protocol. But reasoning at the low level of the implementation is too hard, almost impossible. A second issue is that different implementations of the same archetype have non-uniform behavior. So they have different kinds of interactions and also different economic mechanisms for the same archetype. So given this situation, are there any common properties that all the protocols that implement the same archetype enjoy? In the absence of common properties, it is not possible to reason compositionally about DeFi. It is the idea of DeFi as a Lego finance is difficult to implement without the possibility of modular reasoning. Another source of complexity that, from my point of view, is the interesting thing about DeFi is that the properties enjoyed by these protocols are so complex and go beyond the typical properties that we meet in computer science. There are structural properties that are invariants that all the reasonable implementations of the same archetype should enjoy. An instance of this kind of properties that the tokens cannot be frozen forever within a smart contract, or tokens cannot be duplicated out of the rules. These kind of properties are in the usual domain of computer science, but there are other properties, the economic properties, that measure the effectiveness of the incentive mechanism of DeFi that typically fall outside the domain of computer science. So to be able to reason holistically about the DeFi protocol, we need to combine techniques from different fields. Ideally, we would like to have a tool that takes as input a protocol and the property and outputs true or false, depending on whether the property is satisfied by the protocol or not. Through this tool, we would be more secure to use a DeFi protocol. The question is this a good idea? We have seen that DeFi is so complex. So maybe it is too costly to implement such kind of tools. But there are strong motivation to do so. A single one-letter bug in a DeFi contract could be exploited by adversaries to bring millions of dollars. And adversaries in DeFi are everywhere. They could be simple users, or they can be even more powerful users like miners. And indeed, there are implementations of Ethereum nodes that in some sense act as if they were adversaries by extracting value from user transactions. So, but are these attacks a real concern in practice? Unfortunately, yes. And indeed, there is a long history of exploits to DeFi protocols. And this is a website that gathers some of these exploits. Just note that attacks target many different blockchains. And if you check the list of these incidents, you find that they exploit different kinds of vulnerabilities, either standard bugs in the smart contract or inaccuracies in the economic mechanism, or in some cases also standard acts like phishing. And note that the amount of money targeted by these attacks is huge, more than $2 billion. So in the formal methods branch of computer science, there are some tools and techniques that could be useful to address these issues. The goal here is to devise a formal model of a Defy protocol, which is abstract enough to be able to reason formally about the behavior of the protocol. And in this way, we should abstract away from all the irrelevant implementation details and focus just on the features that are interesting to observe for the adversaries. So this formal model of the protocol should be accompanied by a formal specification of the structural and economic properties that should be enjoyed by the protocol. And ideally, I'd like to prove that the model of a DeFi protocol satisfies all the desired properties. If the model or the properties are too complex, I could still do something like use simulation tools and statistical model checkers to analyze the behavior in the large of these systems. We have used these techniques to reason about lending pools and automated market makers in these two papers. In the rest of the talk, I will focus on lending pools. The first thing that we have done is a definition of the state of a lending pool system. And this state is composed by a set of wallets. These are the user wallets that store the tokens owned by users. And also lending pools are part of the state. A lending pool is just a pair composed by a reserve of tokens and a function that records the debits of all the users. Besides the wallets and the lending pools in the state, we need to have a price oracle, which is used to price tokens. Once we have formalized the state, the next thing we do is we define a transition relation between states. And this transition relation defines how lending pools evolve over time upon user transactions. So this slide contains all the rules that define this transition relation. You see that compared to the implementation of the protocol that consists of many thousands of lines of code, the formal model fits in a single slide. And actually, this semantics is parametric against some economic parameters, like, for instance, the interest rate model here. So actually, we are defining a family of behaviors of lending pools. Once we have a semantics of lending pools, we want to use it to state and prove properties. I will show a few examples of these properties. A simple example is a monotonicity property of the exchange rate. The exchange rate of a token T in a state gamma is the ratio between the reserves of the token in the lending pool, also including all the reserves that are distributed to borrowers, and the supply of the minted token in the state. And we have proved that upon state transitions, the exchange rate is preserved. The only exception is the rule that accrues interest. And in this case, the exchange rate grows, provided that there is at least one user with a debit in the lending pool. So in a sense, this property could be seen as an incentive to users to lend money to the lending pool, because for constant prices, the minted tokens increase their value. And so when a user redeems, the minted tokens increases our net worth. Other examples of properties that we can prove in the model are preservation properties of the global net worth. All the rules preserve the global net worth. There is only one exception, the price update, that of course can affect the global net worth. And if you consider more specifically the net worth of a single user, A, we find that the net worth of a user is preserved by all the action performed by the user, except for the liquidations, which strictly increase the net worth of the user which performed the action. In a sense, this is a nice thing because it is an incentive to users to liquidate under collateralized loans. But if we see in another direction, from the point of view of an adversary, liquidations give rise to front-running attacks, where this would be alleged transactions triggered by users, but an adversary with the power of choosing the order of transaction, like for instance a miner, can always front-run the liquidations sent by other users. And so the standard users, non-miners, will never increase their wealth. And we can try to generalize these kind of attacks to other actions. For instance, we find that an adversary, if is capable of front-running the int transaction that accrue interest, the adversary can always increase. This is a wrong direction. Sorry, it should be in the other side. The net worth in the target state is more than the net worth in the original state, and this happens for deposit, repay, and liquidations. These are only two instances, but more in general, we could ask ourselves whether there is an optimal strategy for an adversary to extract value from transactions. We still don't know this for lending pools, but in this paper, we have studied an optimal strategy through which miners can extract value from any set of user transactions. I think this problem is interesting also for lending pools, and in particular, it becomes even more interesting and more complex when we study the interactions between different kinds of protocols. So the bottom line of my talk is that verifying lending pools and DeFi in general is an hard problem. Formal methods can help with their technique to rigorously model state and transition and with its tools. But we have noticed that doing these proofs by hand is really complex because there are many rules. And so I think that in the future, we will see a switch to proof assistance to develop these kind of proofs. And I think that the two main challenges that we will see in the future is that the verification of properties in actual implementations. We have only proved these properties on a simple model. Proving the same properties implementation could be extremely harder. And another main challenge is to have techniques to enable modular reasoning of properties of composed DeFi applications. Thank you.
Thank you, Massimo. I think it's worth noting that these types of exploits or hacks have rapidly become the biggest area of concern. In crypto crime. There's, the new report out from Chainalysis makes a very clear case for this. But as I tell my students repeatedly, the goal here should not be zero problems, but just fewer problems than in the legacy financial system. And that's really, where the interesting comparison should be. So perhaps we'll have a few minutes to talk about this later, but let's get to our third speaker. We're going to hear next from Professor Kanis Saengchote. Like me, he has pivoted from a different area of economics, which in his case was urban economics, and now studies FinTech. And he is speaking today from Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. So welcome.
Thank you, Professor Yermack, and thank you for having me here. So my background is in traditional corporate household finance. So I'm trying to understand DeFi from the traditional financial perspective. So the objective of today's talk is going to be the comparison of how DeFi lending works compared to traditional lending, and trying to understand who are the users of the loans in DeFi. So first of all, in traditional lending, credit intermediation involves deciding who to get the loan, right? And there's a lot of issues involved, information asymmetry, frictions, and so on. And the intermediation agents take credit risk, interest rate risk, maturity risk, liquidity risk, and so on. And that's why the financial institutions that incur these risks and also the operating costs would incur the lending spread. But in DeFi lending, the lending process works a little differently because of the pseudonymity in public blockchain. Underwriting isn't based on the borrower, but it's more based on the collateral of whoever transacts. So that's why you hear a lot of collateral in today's talk on lending, because without collateral, you won't have access to any lending in DeFi world. And because DeFi are structured via tokens, and you need to minimize the gas cost essentially, all the transactions tend to be perpetual. If you don't repay, then there's no transaction. Again, and also if you don't withdraw your deposit, you won't be paid interest either. That's why you heard talks about the interest-bearing tokens and so on. These are ways that you do the contract bookkeeping in the system so as to minimize the gas costs that you have to incur. And since it's rule-based, it means the whole system can't rely on discretion. It has to be written in our computer algorithms. So it works on a self-reinforcing loop, which can go either way. If it works, it works. And if it doesn't work, then it is whatever the contract says. And we've seen cases where DeFi protocols can be knocked out of equilibrium because of shocks like bank runs and so on. Now, this means DeFi borrowing, DeFi lending involves a very different experience. So if you are looking for a loan, you could be looking for a loan because you need financing, or you could be looking for a loan because you're looking for leveraged investment strategies. So this paper, the objective is to try to get an insight from on-chain data to understand how these loans are being used in the public blockchain. So I want you to have a look at this diagram. This shows the relationships between different addresses inside the blockchain. And these addresses are marked using specific names. For example, some of the names that you see there, Compound, Idle Finance, and so on. These are essentially DeFi protocols, and the addresses of DeFi protocols that would represent their smart contracts, essentially. Because a smart contract is essentially an address inside a blockchain that contains computer codes, and a protocol may involve multiple smart contracts. Part of that reason might be because that protocol requires the creation of tokens, like the interest-bearing tokens. The C token, for example, is essentially a smart contract in itself. So a protocol is a collection of these smart contracts, which can be used as a record, a bookkeeping system, but also tokens are tradable objects, assets themselves. And that's how the protocol designs influence the assets being created in the ecosystem. Some of the assets that are created are essentially depository receipts. That means you send one token to receive another token as a proof that you deposited. So you would need that deposit token to withdraw your funds. Other tokens are more like promissory tokens that are issued with the promise to give you some benefits. Could be voting rights, could be future cash flows that look like equity, for example. And these tokens could be used as an incentive to attract users into the protocol, because the protocols rely on liquidity pool. When you're transacting with DeFi protocol, you are essentially transacting with a mutual pool. So the size of that pool will affect how effective that system is. And We're going to look at the incentive token or the promissory tokens issued by Compound, and to see whether users inside this protocol react to the rewards being provided or not, because protocols need to have liquidity, and protocols may start issuing rewards to incentivize people to interact with the system. And that will be the first questions this paper takes a look at. So people would call this liquidity mining, yield farming, for example. In this paper, I'll use the word liquidity mining. I'll ask two questions. Does the liquidity mining reward actually affect the net deposits? And brief answer is not really. Depositors don't really respond to rewards being provided. But on the other hand, if you are a borrower in this protocol, you would respond to the rewards being provided. Now, in the interest of showing you everything that I want to show, the slides will be available to you afterwards. So I will just go over the key details of each slide, and the rest, you could read the slides or the associated paper if you're interested. This will be from on-chain data combined with Compound's API data as well. And with this, we can combine all this and get some interesting facts about the protocol. So here is some facts that might be interesting, right? The protocol accepts multiple tokens as deposits, but the popular tokens tend to be the ones that are popular out there for users anyway. For example, stable coins would be among the most popular tokens being deposited, and the other non-stable coins would be Ether, wrapped Bitcoin, and the basic attention tokens. Now, these deposits act as also collateral. You do need to have collateral to be able to borrow. And you also have a choice of which token you want to borrow. And if you're borrowing for most purposes, borrowing a stable coin will give you that peace of mind that whatever you have to repay in the end, if you are worried about the monetary value, you can be a little assured about the outstanding loan you have to pay. So this is reflected in the system. About 90% of the loans are made in stable coins. And if you look at the distribution of the depositors, the top 100 depositors will account for about 75% deposits, and the top 100 borrowers will account for about 78%. So this is very similar to the traditional financial system, where you do have large and also small people who interact in the system as well. On the right-hand side are the interest rates and also the utilization rate in the lending pool. The shaded region in gray represents the utilization rate. And as the utilization rate fluctuates over time, so would the borrowing and also the supply rate. That is the lending rate and also the deposit rate, right? And the tokens that are being borrowed would be earning the interest, which would then be distributed toward the depositors. Now you can see the spread is this is net supply and net borrow, because when I say net, this is also net of the rewards that the protocol would distribute to depositors and also borrowers to incentivize the participants to increase the liquidity pool size. Now, it turns out if you look at the net borrow rate and also a net supply rate, if you deposit, say, Ether, and then you also borrow Ether, then your collateral is in the same currency, so to speak, as your loan. That means you're no longer exposed to any exchange rate risk. If you look at the borrowing rate and the deposit rate, that includes the reward that's being distributed, it turns out in a lot of the token denominations, you would actually earn a positive profit, a positive spread from this carry trade by just depositing the tokens and also taking out a loan in the same denomination. So this spread comes from the governance token that is being distributed as reward, right? So this would give you some exposure to this fluctuation in these rates, where essentially your loan and your collateral will be on the same denomination. So I think Professor Kong will be talking about carry trades in this afternoon. So this is one example of carry trade where you borrow and then you also invest in two tokens and earn the positive spread between them as an arbitrage investment strategy. So this is actually one possible use case, okay, from this protocol. So in this paper, we will look at the two views, the macro views, right? We look at the flows inside and outside of the C token contracts. So as suggested earlier, the depositors don't really respond to these rewards. but the borrowers do. Of the 12 tokens that Compound was accepting during that time of study, 10 was being provided with the incentives, and 7 out of 10 tokens that received reward distribution, the borrowing amount is positively related to the rewards being given out. Okay. But the more interesting part, I think, is the micro view. If you look inside each individual addresses that interact with the protocol, you can classify the addresses. So here I manually classify about 500 addresses by looking at the identity on either scan to find out whether they're part of another protocol, or they are just an address, or whether they are an address that contains smart contract codes, then they'll be classified as smart contracts. So the main finding here is that the large wallets and the protocols account for a good portion of the loans. And the 3 types of contracts that have very similar behavior are the yield aggregators. So these are protocols like Yearn, for example, that would invest your tokens using several strategies like hedge fund, for example. Unidentified smart contracts. So these are addresses that contain computer codes inside, but there's no indication of who owns these contracts or what contracts are being written inside. And they act a bit like a private hedge fund, I guess. And then the large wallets, which you could classify as whales. So these would be the ones that have the largest amount of loan and also the shortest loan duration, from 3 days up to 3 weeks, for example. Right. If you look at the liquidations, we saw the word liquidation earlier, that the loan credit risk is being managed by liquidation. Essentially, liquidations do exist, especially when there are sharp drops in token prices. There are a few denominations in loans, but I look at the Ether price as a proxy for how the general market conditions is doing. So there are 3 main episodes of loan liquidations. And they can reach hundreds of millions of dollars. But if you look at the liquidation size compared to the underlying loan, the liquidation amount is only about 2% or so. And this is probably because of the over collateralization that the protocol requires you to put. That is the way they manage credit risk, because there's no interim payment and so on. So the only way for you to be able to ensure that you maintain the payment is to have this over collateralization. We also look at the behavior of borrowers. What do they do when they borrow the tokens? It turns out about 11% or so of borrowers would then redeposit those borrowed tokens inside the protocol again. And as we saw earlier, the protocol gives the incentive reward for people who both deposit and borrow. That's part of that carry trade. This could be another evidence of how participants in DeFi use these protocols. Fast forward to this study we use data up to June 2021, but fast forward to February this year, I was looking at updated data for this conference, and I was looking at the distribution of the tokens, right, in DeFi in general. So who are holding these tokens and how are tokens being used? So I look at Wrapped Bitcoin, DAI, USDC, USDT, and so on. It turns out a lot of the tokens inside DeFi for stable coins are now being tied up in lending, right? And that's no surprise, right? Because when you lend, there are some protocols that can be used for yield farming strategies to earn more token rewards. And if you look at Compound itself, the top holders of the C token, Compound tokens, as of February 2022, for a few of the protocols, the main holders of the tokens are the asset management or yield aggregators. So, and this kind of lines up with the uses of these lending protocols in DeFi, that they show the leverage in investment strategy behavior. Now, if we map this back to what DeFi is good for, right? The lending experience in DeFi for financing might not be very good if you're an entrepreneur, right? Unstable rates and liquidation when it's out of your control. You don't get to renegotiate with the protocol when the market conditions worsen. But if you're looking to leverage your investment strategies, then these protocols provide you with an alternative way of levering up your returns. But it also implicitly means you could end up creating leverage either knowingly, right, by these protocols, or could be unknowingly. Because if you look at the way the tokens work inside DeFi, you could create a new token by depositing one token, right? So if you deposit Ether in MakerDAO to create a DAI stablecoin, you could use that DAI stablecoin to deposit in, say, a lending protocol as collateral, and then borrow or create another depository token, a compound DAI. You could deposit that compound DAI that's created as depository token into another protocol that accepts it as collateral, and then create more tokens, right, along the way. So without keeping track of how things go, you could inadvertently end up creating a lot of leverage. And from the traditional finance point of view, leverage is synonymous with risk. So, given how connected DeFi is, one question that could be raised is DeFi prone to systemic risk? I think that's a very open question right now, and a lot of researchers from traditional finance point of view, like me, are trying to look at this. And yeah, so I think this will be work in progress. But I think one last point that I want to, leave you guys with is, if we look at lending, right? Lending involves three basic tasks: underwriting, monitoring and service, and collecting. Now in DeFi, it allows full visibility of who owns what, and transfers of tokens and so on. But essentially, with the pseudonymity of DeFi, you are turning a repeated game into a one-shot game. And a repeated game essentially is the essence of a lot of financial technologies in the financial system. So, one big important question is, how do we build identity in decentralized finance that is very different from the traditional concept of identity that we're familiar with? Central public registers that have permanent identity. So with this pseudonymity, probably to create the repeated game from this one-shot game again, probably have to think a little bit about what technology is available. So I think I'm out of time, so I will leave you guys to read this takeaway from the deck. And thank you for the opportunity to present here.
Thank you very much, Kanis. And I think the point about the systemic risk is very well taken. It's important and also almost impossible for the government to regulate at this point, which should, justifiably create a lot of concern. So we are a little bit over in time, so we're not going to be able to do Q&A, but I think fortunately we've had some of those questions addressed already by the speakers. So I'd like to thank Kanis, Massimo, and Fabian for three very interesting presentations this morning, and now return back to Kathleen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, Professor Yermack. That was actually amazing. What I love about this interdisciplinary subject is that you all did a great job shedding light on a very complicated topic. And excitingly enough, later today, we'll actually hear from folks who are actually operating businesses in this very exact space.